"You've got potential, but your attitude doesn't fit our culture." That's what they said, 2 weeks after they put my name last on a project I invented, patented, and built from scratch. They fired me thinking I was disposable. But what they didn't know, the attitude they fired was quietly holding the key to a $7.5 million future and a locked patent they'd soon be begging to access. My name is Madeline Scott, and at 34, I'd already spent 6 years pouring my soul into Virion Dynamics, a renewable energy startup in Austin that promised to revolutionize how the world stores power. The glass building gleamed under the Texas sun, all sharp edges and reflective surfaces, a perfect metaphor for the people inside. I was what they called a technical creative, though HR preferred the sanitized term senior innovation engineer. In reality, I was the person who stayed until 2 a.m. debugging code, who filled whiteboards with equations that made CFOs nervous, who actually gave a damn whether our solutions worked beyond the PowerPoint slides. My desk sat in the corner of the 3rd floor, deliberately chosen for its distance from the ping-pong table and kombucha tap. The culture cornerstones our CEO Brent Halverson loved showing off to investors. While others networked over craft beer Fridays, I preferred the company of circuit boards and simulation software. This apparently made me difficult to work with. The truth was simpler. I didn't laugh at Brent's recycled TED Talk jokes. I didn't pretend our mediocre battery management system was groundbreaking just because marketing needed a buzzword. I asked uncomfortable questions in meetings, like why we were promising features we couldn't deliver, or why the advisory board consisted entirely of Brent's fraternity brothers. "You need to be more of a team player," my manager Derek would say, always with that practiced concern that meant nothing. Being a team player, I learned, meant nodding when leadership spoke, meant letting louder voices claim your ideas in brainstorming sessions, meant swallowing your pride when they forgot to invite you to strategy meetings about your own projects. The breaking point started with a weather pattern algorithm I'd developed on my own time, before Virion's lawyers had made us sign those aggressive IP assignment clauses. It could predict energy storage needs based on microclimate data, something that could save millions in wasted capacity. I'd filed the provisional patent myself, paid the fees from my savings, because I believed in protecting ideas that mattered. But in a place like Virion, believing in anything besides the company, mythology was considered a character flaw. They wanted believers, not thinkers. They wanted enthusiasm, not expertise. They wanted people who fit the culture. And I was beginning to understand exactly what that culture was designed to protect. The patent application sat in my desk drawer for 3 months before anyone at Virion knew it existed. U.S. Patent Application 17 for 123,456. Dynamic Energy Storage Optimization using Predictive Weather Modeling. 27 pages of algorithms, schematics, and proof-of-concept data that I developed during countless weekends in my garage workshop. This wasn't some incremental improvement. It was a fundamental shift in how battery arrays could self-regulate based on hyperlocal weather predictions. Everything changed the morning Derek caught me reviewing the USPTO correspondence during my coffee break. His eyes lit up with that particular gleam I'd learned to fear, the look of someone who'd just discovered an opportunity. "This is incredible work, Madeline," he said, sliding into the chair across from me without invitation. "Why didn't you tell us you were working on something this big?" I closed my laptop carefully. "Because I developed it before my employment contract was amended. It's my personal IP." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Derek's smile tightened. "But surely you understand the implications here. This could transform Virion's entire value proposition." Within hours, I was in Brent's corner office, facing him across a desk that cost more than my annual bonus. The city sprawled behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows, a kingdom of glass and ambition that he clearly felt he ruled. "Madeline," he began, hands steepled like a TV evangelist, "we need to talk about alignment." They wanted me to assign the patent to Virion, for the good of the team, for the mission, for the culture. The legal team had even drawn up papers, a patent assignment and cooperation agreement that would transfer all rights for the generous sum of $1 and other valuable consideration. The technology was developed using knowledge gained at Virion, Brent insisted, though we both knew this was a lie. It's only fair that the company benefits from its investment in you. I pushed the papers back across his desk unsigned. The provisional was filed before my current contract. The work was done on my own equipment, on my own time. I'm happy to license it to Virion at market rates. That's when the real Brent emerged from behind the founder's CEO mask. His jaw clenched, eyes narrowing. You're being incredibly short-sighted. This is about being part of something bigger than yourself. No, I said quietly. This is about you wanting to package my innovation into your Series B pitch deck without compensation. The retaliation was swift and surgical. First, they removed me from the project lead role on the system integration I'd been managing for 18 months. We need someone more collaborative, Derek explained. Then came the meeting invitations that arrived an hour after the meetings had ended. The sudden critical performance review citing communication issues in projects where I'd never missed a deadline. My name began disappearing from internal documents. The quarterly innovation report credited the entire energy systems team for breakthroughs I'd personally coded. When vendors called asking for the engineer who designed the predictive model, they were redirected to Thomas, a recent MBA graduate who couldn't explain the difference between kilowatts and kilowatt hours. The final insult came during the all-hands meeting where Brent announced Virion's revolutionary new direction in weather-responsive energy storage. He stood in front of my slides, my diagrams, my math, and proclaimed it as evidence of Virion's collective genius. When someone asked about the technical details, he deflected with practiced ease. Our incredible team has been working tirelessly on this. It's truly a collaborative effort. I sat in the back row, invisible, watching my work being stolen in real time. Around me, coworkers who knew the truth avoided eye contact. Only Lena Torres, a back-end developer who'd become my closest friend at the company, reached over and squeezed my hand. "Document everything," she whispered. "They're building a case." She was right. The next week, I was called into a meeting with HR. Performance improvement plan was the term they used, though we all knew it was corporate speak for find a new job. The complaints were vague but numerous. Resistance to feedback, reluctance to embrace company values. Creating a negative work environment. "Can you provide specific examples?" I asked. The HR manager, a woman named Patricia, who wore her insincerity like expensive perfume, shuffled papers. "It's more about patterns of behavior, your attitude." There it was. That word, attitude. The corporate scarlet letter for anyone who refused to play the game. 2 weeks later, they didn't even pretend to follow the improvement plan timeline. Derek and Patricia flanked me at my desk on a Thursday afternoon, cardboard box in hand, security badge already deactivated. "We've decided to part ways," Patricia announced to the silent floor. "We wish you the best in your future endeavors." As I packed my things, the few personal items that marked 3 years of 70-hour weeks, I kept my face neutral. Let them think they'd won. Let them believe I was just another difficult woman who couldn't hack it in startup culture. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. I carried that cardboard box to my car with the same steady hands that had built their prototype. No tears. No scenes. Just the quiet dignity of someone who understood that the best revenge isn't served cold. It's served with documentation. The Austin heat hit me like a wall as I loaded my possessions into the trunk. Inside that box, between the coffee mug and the stress ball from last year's company retreat, lay 3 USB drives I'd been updating weekly for months. Every email, every design revision, every timestamp showing when files were created, modified, and by whom. Paranoid? Maybe. But in tech, paranoia is just another word for preparation. My phone buzzed before I'd even left the parking lot. "Lena." "Coffee, now, not the usual place." We met at a hole-in-the-wall taco shop on the east side, far from the polished startup corridor where Virion employees typically gathered. Lena looked exhausted, stress etched in lines around her eyes that hadn't been there 6 months ago. "They had an all-hands right after you left," she said without preamble. Brent spun it as a cultural realignment, said they were entering a critical phase and needed everyone fully committed to the vision. I sipped my coffee, bitter and strong. Let me guess, my name never came up. Oh, it did. Lena pulled out her phone, showing me photos she'd taken of presentation slides. "He's accelerating the investor roadshow. They're pitching your weather-responsive system as the cornerstone of their Series B, $30 million target raise." The slides were polished, professional, and built entirely on my work. They'd even used my variable naming conventions in the code snippets, a detail that would mean nothing to investors but told me everything about how hastily they'd appropriated my system. "There's more," Lena continued, voice dropping. "Thomas has been asking everyone about your documentation, where you kept files, who had access to your research notes. They're trying to reconstruct your development process." "Let them try." I pulled out my phone and showed her an email timestamp. "Patent application filed 8 months ago. Full documentation submitted to USPTOs. Previous art established before I signed their updated IP agreement." Lena's eyes widened. "You knew this would happen?" "I suspected." I closed the phone. When a company's culture rewards theft and punishes integrity, you protect yourself. That night, I sat in my home office, the same space where I'd developed the algorithm, and drafted emails to 3 patent attorneys. By morning, I'd retained Elizabeth Matsuda, a former engineer turned IP lawyer who specialized in David versus Goliath cases. "Your documentation is impeccable," she said during our first meeting, paging through my evidence binders. "But they'll fight dirty. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about the box in my car, the years of innovations I'd contributed only to be erased from the narrative. "They already fought dirty. I'm just responding in kind." Elizabeth smiled, sharp, knowing. "Good. First step, we file for expedited examination. Second, we register your copyright on the codebase. Third, we wait." The waiting was the hardest part. I took contract work, boring but well paid. Automating systems for companies that valued functionality over flash. I kept my LinkedIn quiet, turned down recruiter calls from Virion's competitors, let them think I'd retreated, licking wounds. Meanwhile, Lena became my eyes inside Virion. The stories she shared during our weekly coffee meetings painted a picture of escalating desperation. The development team couldn't replicate my results. The system worked, barely. But without understanding the underlying mathematics, they couldn't optimize it or fix emerging bugs. "Brent hired a team of consultants," Lena reported one evening. "MIT graduates. They're reverse engineering your code, but..." She grinned. "You remember those inefficient recursive functions Derek always complained about?" I smiled for the first time in weeks. Those functions weren't inefficient, they were elegant, but only if you understood the mathematical proofs behind them. Without that knowledge, they looked like overwrought code from an amateur. "They're planning the big announcement next month," Lena continued. "Already sent save the dates to major investors. The future of renewable energy storage. They're calling it..." I made a note in my phone. "Next month." That gave me 6 weeks. Elizabeth worked with quiet efficiency, filing motions and registrations with the precision of someone who'd spent years watching startups cannibalize their own talent. When the patent office responded with initial approval for expedited examination, she called me immediately. "We're moving faster than expected. They'll publish the patent before Virion's event if we maintain this pace." But I had something better in mind. What if we don't publish immediately? What if we wait until they've made their claims publicly? Elizabeth's pause told me she understood. That's aggressive, and potentially more damaging to them. "They fired me for having an attitude," I said, looking at the framed photo of my team, former team, still sitting on my desk. Maybe it's time I showed them what that actually looks like. The announcement came with all the Silicon Valley fanfare Brent could muster. TechCrunch, VentureBeat, even a mention in the Wall Street Journal's tech section. Virion Dynamics secures 7.5 million strategic partnership with Northgrid Energy. The headlines painted Brent as a visionary, a climate tech pioneer bridging the gap between innovation and implementation. I read the press release from my kitchen table, coffee growing cold as I parsed through the corporate doublespeak. Proprietary weather-responsive storage technology. Revolutionary predictive algorithms. Industry-first optimization system. Every buzzword carefully chosen to obscure the truth. They were selling my brain as their product. The demo video was the worst part. Brent stood in Virion's lab, my equations visible on whiteboards behind him, explaining our breakthrough to a reporter who nodded along eagerly. When asked about the development process, he smiled that practiced founder smile. Innovation is a team sport here at Virion. We've built a culture where great ideas can come from anywhere. Lena texted me screenshots from the company Slack. Celebration emojis. Congratulations flowing like champagne. The dev team suddenly promoted, bonuses promised, equity grants dangled like golden carrots. Thomas, poor, clueless Thomas, was now Director of Energy Innovation Systems. A title as empty as his understanding of the technology. But Northgrid Energy wasn't some naive venture fund dazzled by pitch decks. They were a 40-year-old Canadian infrastructure company with teams of engineers who understood the difference between marketing and mathematics, which is why my cease and desist letter, sent through Elizabeth, landed like a precision-guided missile. Dear Northgrid Energy Executive Team, it began. It has come to our attention that your recently announced partnership with Virion Dynamics involves technology covered under U.S. Patent Application 17123-456, Dynamic Energy Storage Optimization using Predictive Weather Modeling. Sole inventor Madeline Scott. Elizabeth had crafted it perfectly, professional, factual, and devastating. We attach the patent filing receipts, the prosecution history showing my personal ownership, and just enough technical documentation to prove that Virion's breakthrough was actually my intellectual property. The response came within 48 hours, not from Northgrid's PR team or business development, from their chief legal officer. Ms. Scott, we take intellectual property rights very seriously. We are immediately suspending all technology transfer activities pending a thorough review. We would appreciate the opportunity to discuss this matter directly. I forwarded the email to Elizabeth with 2 words. Game on. The panic at Virion was immediate and spectacular. Lena described emergency meetings stretching past midnight, Brent's voice carrying through the glass walls of conference rooms. The legal team descended like locusts, demanding access to every file, every email, every Slack message that mentioned the energy storage system. They're trying to build a case that you developed it on company time, Lena warned during a hurried phone call. Derek's been creating retroactive documentation, backdating meeting notes. Let them, I said, pulling up my meticulously organized folders. Fraud leaves its own trail. But Brent wasn't stupid, just arrogant. His next move was predictable, a settlement offer delivered through Virion's general counsel. They'd pay me $50,000 for a full release of claims and assignment of the patent. More than generous, the letter stated. Considering your brief tenure and junior position. I didn't respond. Instead, Elizabeth and I prepared our counter-offer, not to Virion, but to Northgrid. The video call with Northgrid's executive team was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. I wore my best blazer, the one I'd bought for conference presentations back when I still believed Virion might value competence over politics. 3 faces appeared on screen: CEO Margaret Chen, CTO James Okafor, and their chief legal officer, Patricia Smythe. Mrs. Scott, Margaret began without preamble. We've reviewed your patent application and the documentation you've provided. We have some questions. For the next hour, I walked them through the technology, not the marketing version Brent had pitched, but the real system. The mathematical models, the edge cases, the scalability challenges, and their solutions. I shared my screen, showing code repositories with timestamps predating my Virion employment, research notes from my garage laboratory, even utility bills proving I'd been running high-draw experiments at home. James, the CTO, asked the kinds of questions only an engineer would know to ask. About specific optimization functions, about failure modes, about integration with legacy systems. Questions that Thomas, despite his shiny new title, could never have answered. One more thing, I said as the call was winding down. I've prepared a demonstration, not slides or simulations, actual performance data from a working prototype. I switched to a live feed from my garage, where I'd rebuilt a smaller version of the system. Over 6 months of unemployment, I'd refined it further. Implementing improvements Virion's team would never have imagined because they didn't understand the foundation. The silence when I finished was profound. Then Margaret spoke. Ms. Scott, I think we need to discuss a different kind of partnership. Lena later told me that the same afternoon, Virion received formal notice from Northgrid. The partnership was terminated, citing misrepresentations regarding intellectual property ownership. The $7.5 million deal, the one that was supposed to secure Virion's Series B and cement Brent's reputation, evaporated like morning mist in the Texas sun. The implosion began with a single email that somehow found its way to TechCrunch. Leaked, Virion Dynamics in IP crisis as $7.5 million deal collapses. By noon, it was the top story in 3 industry newsletters. By evening, Reddit's startup community was dissecting every claim Brent had made in his interviews. Lena called me from her car, whispering even though she was alone. It's chaos. Absolute chaos. The board called an emergency meeting. 2 investors are already threatening to pull out. She described the scene inside Virion like a war correspondent from the front lines. Engineers huddled in corners, updating resumes on company time. The sales team, who'd been promised commissions on the Northgrid deal, openly questioned leadership in Slack channels. The ping-pong table sat unused, a monument to a culture that had prioritized appearance over substance. But the real bombshell came from an unexpected source. Thomas, the MBA who'd been paraded as the face of my innovation. Turns out, even an empty suit has a conscience when faced with potential fraud charges. His resignation letter, posted publicly on LinkedIn, was a masterpiece of corporate self-preservation. I cannot in good conscience continue to represent work that I neither created nor fully understand, he wrote. The innovative technology attributed to my leadership was developed entirely by Madeline Scott, whose termination I now deeply regret staying silent about. Elizabeth called me immediately. This changes our leverage significantly. We need to move fast. The leak that followed Thomas's resignation was surgical in its precision. Internal emails surfaced showing Brent explicitly instructing the team to minimize Scott's involvement and restructure the narrative for investor appeal. Derek's ham-fisted attempts to backdate documentation were exposed when metadata revealed the true creation dates. Most damaging was a recorded Zoom call where Brent bragged about acquiring the technology through strategic human resource management. I watched it all unfold from my home office, feeling strangely detached. This wasn't revenge, it was justice serving itself. The investigative reporter from Austin Business Journal reached out through Elizabeth. Ms. Scott, would you be willing to go on record about your experience at Virion? I declined. The evidence spoke louder than any interview could. Besides, I had more important calls to take. Northgrid's offer was elegant in its simplicity. Exclusive licensing rights to my patent for 5 years, with a $2 million upfront payment and 15% royalties on any commercial implementation. They also wanted me as a technical consultant, recognizing what Virion had failed to see, that the creator of the technology might actually be valuable in developing it further. We believe in investing in people, not just IP. Margaret, their CEO, explained during our negotiation call. Your innovation is impressive, but your integrity in this situation has been equally so. Meanwhile, Virion was hemorrhaging talent and capital. The Series B round, which had been oversubscribed based on the Northgrid partnership, evaporated overnight. Investors who'd written checks demanded answers. The board, finally awakening from their Brent-induced stupor, launched an internal investigation. Lena sent me photos from inside the office. Half the desks were empty. The kombucha tap had been removed. Apparently, it was a rental. The inspirational quotes on the walls seemed like bitter jokes now. Move fast and break things had certainly taken on new meaning. She also forwarded me something else, a company-wide email from Patricia in HR. They were offering to revisit my termination, suggesting it had been a miscommunication that could be resolved amicably. I drafted my response carefully. Dear Patricia, thank you for reaching out. I remember our last conversation clearly. You said I had an attitude problem that was creating a negative work environment. You were right. I did have an attitude. I believe that integrity mattered more than optics. That innovation required truth, not just enthusiasm. That a company culture built on theft and deception would eventually collapse under its own weight. That attitude hasn't changed. I will not be returning to Virion. My patent remains my own, as does my dignity. Best regards, Madeline Scott, P.S. You might want to update your LinkedIn. I noticed Virion is no longer listed as your current employer. The final board meeting happened on a Thursday. Lena Liv texted me from her desk as security escorted Brent from the building. His Tesla key fob and company MacBook surrendered at reception. The man who'd built his reputation on my work left with the same cardboard box they'd given me, though I doubt his contained 3 USB drives of evidence. Derek lasted another week before pursuing other opportunities. The dev team scattered to competitors who suddenly found Virion engineers very available and very willing to share stories over beer. But the moment that truly closed this chapter came during a video call with my new colleagues at Northgrid. We were reviewing implementation timelines when James, their CTO, made an offhand comment. You know, Madeline. When we first met with Virion, something felt off. Brent couldn't answer basic technical questions. Now we know why. He was pitching someone else's brilliance as his own. How did you know to dig deeper? I asked. Margaret smiled. Simple. In 40 years of business, I've learned that real innovators can explain their work at any level of detail. Pretenders can only recite the executive summary. The lawsuit came as no surprise. Virion Dynamics v. Madeline Scott filed in Austin District Court, claiming breach of confidentiality, misappropriation of trade secrets, and tortious interference with business relations. Brent might have been gone, but the company's death throes included one final attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. Elizabeth reviewed the filing in her office, occasionally chuckling at particularly desperate claims. They're alleging you developed the technology using company resources. They've submitted cafeteria receipts as evidence you were on campus during development. What? Cafeteria receipts? I leaned forward to see the documents. I bought coffee. With my own credit card. It gets better. She flipped to another page. They're claiming the electricity you use to charge your laptop in the office constitutes company resource usage for personal projects. We both knew this was theater, a dying company's attempt to either force a settlement or poison my relationship with Northgrid. What they didn't know was that Margaret had already called me personally when the lawsuit was announced. Madeline, we've dealt with desperate competitors before. Northgrid stands behind you. Our legal team is at your disposal. The preliminary hearing was set for a Tuesday morning in Judge Rita Gonzalez's courtroom. I arrived early, wearing the same blazer I'd worn for my Northgrid interview, my armor for battles that mattered. Elizabeth had assembled a team of 3 associates, each armed with boxes of documentation. Virion's legal team looked expensive but exhausted. Their lead counsel, a silver-haired man named Harrison Wade, had the demeanor of someone arguing a case he didn't believe in. Across the aisle sat the interim CEO, a turnaround specialist named Marcus Webb who'd been brought in to salvage what was left of the company. Your Honor, Wade began. Virion Dynamics invested significant resources in developing innovative energy storage solutions. Ms. Scott, as an employee, was part of that development team. Judge Gonzalez interrupted. Counsel, I've reviewed the preliminary filings. Do you have any evidence that Ms. Scott's patent application doesn't predate her employment agreement. Wade shuffled papers. We believe discovery will reveal. That's not what I asked. Do you have evidence now? The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Wade admitted, not documentary evidence, Your Honor, but witness testimony will show. From whom? Elizabeth stood smoothly. Your Honor, we've prepared a timeline showing Ms. Scott filed her provisional patent 8 months before joining Virion. We have utility bills showing power usage at her home laboratory. We have receipts for equipment purchases. We even have date-stamped photos of her garage workshop. I watched the judge's expression as Elizabeth systematically demolished each of Virion's claims. The coffee receipts were met with barely concealed eye-rolling. The electricity usage argument actually prompted a laugh. But the killing blow came from an unexpected source. Elizabeth called Lena Torres as a witness. Ms. Torres, Elizabeth began after establishing her credentials. You were employed as a senior developer at Virion during Ms. Scott's tenure. Yes. Can you describe the development process for the energy storage system? Lena looked directly at the Virion legal team as she answered. Madeline worked alone. She would come in with solutions already tested and documented. We used to joke that she had a secret lab, because her code always worked on the first integration. Turns out, we were right. Did you ever see her developing this technology on company equipment? Never. She was meticulous about keeping her personal work separate. She even used a different laptop, an old ThinkPad instead of the company MacBook. Wade tried to cross-examine, but Lena had come prepared with her own documentation, emails, Slack messages, even photos from team meetings showing Madeline's personal laptop clearly visible on the conference table. One more thing, Lena added as Wade retreated. I kept copies of the JIT commit history. The code Virion is claiming as theirs. It was pushed to the company repository by Thomas Chen, 2 weeks after Madeline was terminated. The metadata shows it was copied from external drives, not developed internally. The mention of forensic evidence sent Wade into whispered conference with his clients. After 5 minutes, he stood. Your Honor, we'd like to request a recess to discuss settlement. Judge Gonzalez's response was swift. No, counsel. We're going to finish this today. She turned to the court reporter. Let the record show that the plaintiff has presented no credible evidence supporting their claims. The timeline clearly indicates Ms. Scott's innovation predates her employment. The ruling was everything Elizabeth had predicted. Complete dismissal with prejudice, meaning Virion couldn't refile. But Judge Gonzalez wasn't finished. I'm also granting the defendant's counter-motion for sanctions. This lawsuit appears to be a bad faith attempt to interfere with Ms. Scott's legitimate business relationships. Virion Dynamics will pay all legal fees and costs. As we packed our boxes of evidence, most of it unneeded, Marcus Webb approached. The interim CEO looked tired, older than his LinkedIn photo suggested. Mrs. Scott, he said quietly, I apologize for this waste of everyone's time. For what it's worth, I've reviewed the real history of what happened, the company, the culture. It was broken long before I arrived. I studied him for a moment. What happens to Virion now? Chapter 11, Bankruptcy, most likely. The IP portfolio is worthless without your patent. The investors want their money back. The employees, he shrugged. They've mostly moved on already. As I left the courthouse, my phone buzzed with messages. Margaret from Northgrid. Never doubted you for a second. Lena. That felt good to say out loud. Even Thomas, the empty suit, had sent a LinkedIn message. I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. But the last message was the one that mattered. Elizabeth forwarded an email from Wade's firm. Our client has agreed to pay all sanctions and legal fees within 30 days. Total amount, $287,000. Justice, it turned out, came with a price tag. And Virion was finally paying it. The contract with Northgrid arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier to my home office. The same space where everything had begun. $2 million upfront, plus royalties that would generate passive income for years. The number felt surreal, but not as surreal as the title on the consulting agreement, Chief Innovation Architect. I signed it with the same pen I'd used for my patent application. 6 months later, I stood in Northgrid's new Austin facility, watching technicians install the first commercial unit of my weather-responsive storage system. Margaret had flown down for the launch, bringing half her executive team. The lab was everything Virion's had pretended to be, functional over flashy, built for innovation rather than Instagram posts. The initial deployment is exceeding projections by 23%, James reported, pulling up real-time data on the monitoring screens. The predictive accuracy is remarkable. I allowed myself a small smile. Of course it was. I'd had an extra year to refine the algorithms while Virion fumbled with their stolen version. Lena joined me for lunch that day, now a senior architect at a legitimate clean energy company. "Did you hear?" she asked between bites of breakfast tacos. "Virion's assets are being auctioned next week. The ping pong table is starting at $50. And Brent?" Last I heard, he was giving talks about lessons learned from startup failure, charging speakers fees to explain how the tech industry needs more authenticity. We both laughed at the irony. The Austin Business Journal ran a feature about Northgrid's expansion, with my photo on the cover. From Fired to Fortune, how one engineer's attitude problem became a multi-million-dollar innovation. They'd wanted to make it a story about revenge, about vindication. But sitting in my new office, walls lined with whiteboards covered in new equations, new possibilities, I realized it was never about them. Derek reached out once, a rambling LinkedIn message about how he'd always believed in my potential, how he'd tried to protect me from the politics. I archived it without responding. Some bridges, once burned, provide better light than passage. But the moment that crystallized everything came during a panel discussion at UT Austin's engineering school. A young woman, probably a junior, raised her hand during Q&A. "Ms. Scott, what advice would you give someone who feels like their workplace doesn't value their contributions, when being good at your job isn't enough?" I thought about the cardboard box, the USB drives, the nights spent documenting every slight and stolen idea, about Judge Gonzalez's verdict and Margaret's trust, about the difference between fitting into a culture and finding one that fits you. "Document everything," I said finally. "Know your worth, not just emotionally, but legally. And remember that sometimes, the best response to a toxic culture isn't to change it from within. Sometimes it's to build something better, without them." The auditorium erupted in applause, but I was already thinking about the next innovation, the next problem to solve. Because that's what they never understood at Virion. It was never about the recognition or the politics, or even the money. It was about the work. It always had been. Standing in my lab that evening, reviewing the day's performance data, I thought about those final words they'd thrown at me. Attitude problem. My reflection in the monitor smiled back. They were right. I did have an attitude. I believed my work had value. I believed integrity mattered more than conformity. I believed that innovation required truth, not theater. And that attitude, it was now worth $7.5 million, and climbing. My phone buzzed, another interview request, another company wanting to know the secret to innovation. I declined politely. The real secret was simple. While they were playing politics, I was building the future. While they were stealing credit, I was securing patents. While they were crafting narratives, I was creating value they could neither understand nor replicate. "You called it attitude," I said to the empty lab. To the ghosts of Virion's arrogance, I call it ownership. And ownership, as they learned too late, is everything. Thank you for listening to this story of justice in the modern workplace. Where are you tuning in from today? I'd love to hear in the comments below and connect with fellow listeners around the world. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and share your own thoughts about standing up for what's right in your career. Your experiences matter. and our community grows stronger when we share them together.